everyone to this panel discussion organised by the Pat Finucane Centre in conjunction with Féile and Phobail. My name's Anne Cadwallader and I'll be chair for the session. I'm an advocacy caseworker with the Pat Finucane Centre, which works with families who were bereaved during the conflict and who want to find out more about how their loved ones died, and through research and by liaising with the police ombudsman, the courts and others. I'm also the author of a book called Lethal Allies, which you may have heard of, about the Glenanne killings. Our panel may already be well known to you, they should be, but here's a short introduction. Paddy Murray is a passionate and committed human rights solicitor based in Belfast. He recently represented the Ballymurphy families at the inquest into the death of the 10 people shot dead on the streets of the city, culminating in a judgment that all 10 were uninvolved civilians who posed no threat to the soldiers. Gemma McKeown is a solicitor working with the North's premier human rights watchdog, the Committee on the Administration of Justice. One of her clients is the family of Sean McKenna, one of the hooded men who were interned and tortured in 1971. Sean died as a direct result of his injuries, although no one has ever been held accountable. And Gemma does, of course, also represent many other people. Sandra Peake runs the North's largest victims advocacy group, offering cross-community advice, friendship, support, and truth recovery. She has a huge knowledge and experience of the problems faced by victims' families and those who were injured physically or psychologically during the conflict. And last but not least is Tony Doherty, who's chair of the Bloody Sunday Trust. His father was one of the 14 killed, and he's written 2 best-selling books about growing up in Derry. They're This Man's Wee Boy and The Dead Beside Us, a memoir of growing up in Derry. He spent 4 years in jail and is now regional coordinator of the Healthy Living Centre Alliance. Now, the obvious focus of this discussion, as it's taking place at this particular historical moment, will be the recent so-called command paper on legacy issued by the British government last week and the many concerns arising from that. And Paddy, if I could come to you first, may I ask you about Ballymurphy, which showed the capacity of inquests to give consolation to families despite 40 years elapsing. The British government has said that it's too late to look into these deaths. With the passing of time, it's just not possible. What would be your response to that?
Well, I don't think that's correct. And I think Justice Keegan's findings confirm that despite the passage of years, almost 50 years, we were able to piece together the evidence and which led to the very substantial and critical findings of the coroner. The inquest system has changed dramatically over the last number of years. They're very different from the original inquest in Ballymurphy in 1972. They're an entirely different species, and that's been in large part due to the emerging jurisprudence from the European Court of Human Rights, the McCann case, the Jordan case, and many other cases from the north of Ireland, where families took their legal fight to the international courts because they were getting no remedies within the domestic courts. So we've found that the inquest route is a viable route, and there are a number of other reasons as well. In my opinion, the court allows you to excavate the truth, because very often, as we all know, the truth is buried, and you need tools to bring that truth out. And one of the important tools, and the Bloody Sunday families would probably have found this in the inquiry as well, is the right to access to the documentation, which you don't have in other legal other forums that are non-legal. But very importantly, the opportunity to examine or cross-examine witnesses, and we were able to do that very constructively in Ballymurphy, particularly military witnesses who obviously don't concede certain facts within their witness statement to the inquest, but during the course of their evidence, we were able to stretch that evidence and bring a picture to the court of what actually happened in Ballymurphy in 1971. And I have to say the civilian witnesses were able to do that as well. So, in my opinion, legal processes are very important, and we now have an independent judiciary. And our community now have confidence in the judiciary, in my opinion. So it's no accident that the timing of these proposals follow the Ballymurphy inquest and other legal developments that we've had in this jurisdiction. So, I mean, I think the proof's in the pudding that they're now afraid, they're running scared of the legal processes, they're running scared of the independent judiciary, and they want to have a closed, non-public mechanism, information recovery, which will, the details are very vague in the paper, but which will have much less powers and won't have that public dimension to it.
The implication of what London said was that it's cruel to put families through the mill of the courts, that it increases their suffering without any response from them. I mean, is it your experience that the families suffered psychologically and emotionally during the Ballymurphy inquest?
No, the families suffered for 50 years not having the truth. They suffered through their interface with the criminal justice system in the immediate aftermath of the inquest, where they were treated abysmally by the judiciary, by the legal system. That was suffering. What we have found in the last year and a half through the inquest is, not to say that there weren't difficult days at the inquest, hearing how your loved one was killed. And one day in particular comes to mind, when the family of Joan Connolly had to listen to the very detailed evidence of one of the witnesses. I think her name was Agnes Keenan, or I think she was born Agnes O'Hare, who described in vivid detail how their mother was killed, and also described how she was very cruelly placed at the back of a military Land Rover as well. So those days were difficult, but they were necessary for the family to find out what happened to them. And I think the British government should listen to those families and take their views on board after the inquest, because I have spoken to them during the course of the inquest and after the inquest, and that experience for them was very, very important. I also think it has a bigger objective in that it can help bring about reconciliation, because if I mean, the stumbling block to reconciliation hasn't been the family's quest for truth, it has been the blocking of that, and that has undermined the rule of law. So I mean, days that we had on the 11th of May in Ballymurphy not only were very momentous days for the family, but also the wider Ballymurphy community and beyond, who suffered for many decades at the hand of the British and also previous unionist governments. Not only the physical violence and brutality that we were able to show, but the structural violence of discrimination in housing. So they have really suffered. And to have that day in court where they see the families coming out very satisfied with the findings, I think that plays a bigger role and bringing about some confidence in the justice mechanisms and also the peace process as well. So very far from suffering, I think that this process can be healing, and good legal decisions can rebuild broken worlds, and I hope that Ballymurphy can do that. This development has obviously been a setback to many families and will be very distressing to them. And I'm sure Sandra and the others and Gemma and Tony can talk to that as well. And that's my feeling back from families, that this has been very difficult for them.
Just as a lawyer, we're talking at the moment in a state of great uncertainty, because we don't know really what the British are going to be proposing, and they are just proposals, you know, it's far from certain. But is it legally possible for them to stop and halt inquests which have already begun? Because I can think of one family, for example, of Sean Brown, who was killed outside the GA ground in Balachi, where that family's already attended 30 plus preliminary hearings. Can that inquest now be halted?
You're quite right. I mean, the proposals are very vague, and I have read the document, despite it's 30-something pages. There's very little detail on what the proposal is to replace these legal mechanisms. I think that any proposal that takes out the inquest, civil actions, is going to be subject to challenge under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. You know, that I don't think they can replace those mechanisms with a viable, effective investigation, and which also meets the other procedural obligations under Article 2 as well. I also think that the retrospective nature of it is going to be problematic under Article 6 and the right to fair adjudication. And there's some case law to support that they're very narrow and very exceptional circumstances where retrospective legislation would be acceptable and wouldn't be in breach of the convention as well. So I think there are a number of grounds on which these families could take a legal challenge if these proposals stay in their current format. But we'll have to look at the detail of that, and any legal challenge now is premature. We're going to have to see any draft legislation or more detailed proposals. But I have no doubt that this is going to be litigated if we have anything of the nature, you know, that we've seen in that document.
Well, when I hear that word litigation, a kind of cold shudder goes through my body. Bring me to you, Gemma. I mean, if we have to here in the north of Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, look to international bodies to vindicate our human rights, and international bodies such as the European Convention on Human Rights, which is enforced by the European Commission, the European Court of Human Rights. I mean, if it comes to it and the British government try to do something that lawyers believe is illegitimate and illegal under the European Convention on Human Rights, first of all, how long will it take to get that sorted out through the European courts? And secondly, in the meantime, while we're getting that sorted out, can the British bulldoze their way through human rights and just ignore the European Convention?
Well, as Padraig has stated, there's clear obligations on the UK in relation to investigations here, both the right to life and also where there's been violations of the right to be free from torture. And both of those obligations basically have there's a positive duty to then investigate where there has been a death or wrongful use of torture. But in particular, what's of concern is that this is effectively shutting down the mechanisms that have already been signed off at the European Court level. 20 years ago, there were cases taken from Northern Ireland to the European Court, the cases of Finucane, Jordan, McCurr, McShane, Shanahan and Kelly. And those cases basically established what a proper investigation should look like. Those cases basically resulted in the European Court saying that any investigation into a breach has to be independent, it has to be prompt, public, involve the families, and of particular importance, it has to be effective. And effectively, this command paper is proposing to shut down inquests, which have been established as being Article 2 compliant. The Police Ombudsman's Office, which is deemed Article 2 compliant. So in effect, they're going to be violating a further set of victims and survivors who have engaged in the inquest system through the legacy inquest unit established by the Lord Chief Justice. So yes, there will be violations. Clearly, in our view, that this package breaches the duty to investigate, whether it's this information recovery body. It doesn't demonstrate any indication that it will have full policing powers. It has a national security veto, effectively to blanket out any information that may actually get to families and survivors. The use of a statute of limitations is obviously in effect an amnesty, and the European Court has looked at amnesties previously in some cases, and really looking on the face of these proposals, it's our view that it is in clear breach of the Convention duty to investigate. Amnesties have been used across the world, particularly in dictatorships, not in democracies. And the experiences has been the European Court may look at this and decide that it does not comply with the duty to investigate. There's been research done on amnesties. Professor Malander in particular has done research on it. And her critique is that the European Court will look at this and ask, is this proposal going to shut down investigations? Clearly it does. So that's a negative mark against it. Will it basically provide impunity for state actors? Yes. Is it necessary for reconciliation? Well, the argument would be that it's not. We're 23 years after a peace process, so clearly it's not a strong argument that this is going to be encouraging the peace process. Certainly it's more likely to have a contrary effect, given that the majority of the responses to this amnesty are an objection. But looking forward, obviously, as Padraig says, we need to see the legislation to establish what the challenges will be. If it comes through Westminster, which is obviously the likely source, that would be primary legislation, and that would be subject to a challenge under the Human Rights Act. A challenge under the Human Rights Act would be seeking to declare that it doesn't comply with, isn't compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. And even if we went through that process of families going to the High Court here and exhausting the process all the way to the Supreme Court, which could take months, years, it really depends on how quickly it's fast-tracked. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that the government then has to set aside the legislation. It's not binding on Westminster. A declaration of incompatibility effectively is something that is then left with the Parliament to decide how it wants to respond. It can bring in remedial orders, it could bring in new legislation, or it could ignore it, which it has done in other incidents. Yeah.
I was just going to say that a colleague of mine refers to the British government as being a bit like Millwall supporters. Everybody hates us and we don't care. So if the relatives here hate the British government because they're behaving so appallingly, and the European Court rules that the British government has not abided by the convention, and everybody that has any status or standing in terms of human rights and decency and what we understand to be the rule of law, can the British government act like a Millwall supporter and say, we don't care, you can rule against us, and we're just going to carry on and implement this law and don't give anything, no notion at all of caring about human rights and the feelings of people here who've lost relatives in the conflict? Can they get away with it?
Well, they're a signatory to the European Convention, so they've signed up to it. Like they were one of the founding members of the European Convention, so they have signed up to it. And if they're in breach, they will be held to account through, if there's to be a violation found against them, through the Committee of Ministers. It's really up to then the member states, the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, then to hold them to account. Unfortunately, there is a degree of political sensitivity around these matters, and our view is that it isn't just the sort of the European dimension, there's the UN wider connection, and obviously there's a great role for the UN bodies, treaty bodies. You know, they signed up to the the Convention Against Torture, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They signed up to principles to combat impunity and to prevent recurrence of human rights violations. Those commitments are meaningless and empty if they effectively are going to tear up the rule of law and provide impunity for human rights violations. And not only that, providing examples and obviously succor to other states who want to carry out human rights violations with impunity. So from our point of view, it's a shocking state of affairs for a democracy that's committed to the rule of law to be bringing forward these proposals. And certainly it will be, I presume, litigated when the legislation comes through, and it will presumably go as far as the Strasbourg.
If I was, I have the nightmare vision of if I was somebody who had a relative who died in the conflict and who wanted to find out the truth about it, I would be saying to myself on listening to this, my challenge to the British government is going to end up in the courts and will be tied up in the courts for years and years and years. In the meantime, my elderly relatives are likely to pass away without ever having the truth, acknowledgement, and apology in many cases that they deserve. Would I be right in having that nightmare?
Well, I think the history shows that, you know, the delay and prevarication has permeated through all of the investigations. Families have had to fight, you know, nothing's ever come freely, whether it's Bloody Sunday, Pat Finucane or Ballymurphy. You know, families have had to litigate and act, you know, advocate for their right to an investigation. So unless there is a unilateral change by this government and they decide to uphold the rule of law and to comply with what is their international human rights obligations, it's unlikely that there will be any fast results or sort of investigations for families in the future.
Yeah, I don't want to be too depressing, because after all 5 main parties at Stormont oppose this proposal, and all NGOs that represent victims, to my knowledge, also oppose this proposal. I cannot imagine that the US administration will be in support of it. So I think there's an awful lot still to play for here, and it is far from a done deal. And we at the Pat Finucane Centre, and I'm sure in liaison with you guys also, will be fighting back against this over the summer and into the autumn to make sure it doesn't get through Westminster as it is.
Certainly, yeah. I think across, whether it's legal, NGO, political, you know, everyone is outraged by this, and certainly we will be taking all necessary steps that we feel is appropriate. And it's obviously incumbent upon our political representatives in Stormont to make sure that they are not complicit with this, and obviously to stand strong and resist effectively any interference in the devolution settlement. It's potentially undermining our justice system on our rule of law in Northern Ireland, and certainly our view would be that we should certainly be resisting this at political and legal remedies.
Well, we've been talking a lot about law and about international bodies and politics, but Sandra, you represent a lot of people from both sides of the community who've lost loved ones during the conflict. You must have been fielding hundreds of phone calls from relatives who want to know what this means for them. At this remove, we're still really at the beginning of this battle, but with a few days now gone past since the command paper was announced, what is your impression of how bereaved relatives have responded to the proposals?
I think there are many people deeply upset and angry, and feel that their loved one's life is devalued, that it suggests that their loved one didn't matter. They no longer matter to the state. They haven't mattered to the state, and also to those who perpetrated that they're of no longer of concern. either, and that is very difficult. I think the other big issue, I think, for many families is about inequity. You know, if you have a young man who has been killed through knife crime, and it's suggested that there's a sectarian aspect to it, and now we'll draw a line under it, we wouldn't, and the UK government wouldn't do this on the streets of London, Manchester, Cardiff or Glasgow with somebody if it was a race crime. So why do they feel it's acceptable to apply that principle here? In the same way, you know, families have said that they wouldn't do it in relation to the July the 7th families, or indeed Manchester, and you know, there's real concern about inequity in relation to why they're being treated like this. But I think it's fair to say that, you know, for many people, I mean, I think that an amnesty, and that's what they view it as, that it really undermines the rule of law, and families are living often in communities whereby they still have paramilitary groups that are active, and they also, for some as well, continue to see those that were involved in their loved ones' deaths. And that makes it very difficult, so that, you know, I always think of a lady and the people who were involved in her loved one's death smirk at her, wink at her, say her name when they see her at mass and in the shops, and make her feel generally uncomfortable. And he was not taken last year, the year before, or indeed 5 years before. He was taken 30 years before. So if you have people who are willing to continue to jeer and to make families' lives very unpleasant, can you imagine what they'll be like with an amnesty when they're effectively told they're no longer of interest to the state? And I think that's a sad reality for families here, that particularly those whose loved ones were killed at the hands of their own community, that they continue to suffer very deeply in relation to the intimacy of what happened here and what has been left. And it's very much that they want to know fully what happened. And if the opportunity exists, and I think that families are not all assuming that there'll be a massive level of prosecutions, but in the small number of instances, if the opportunity exists for prosecutions, then the families that many of them that I have dealt with have said, I'd like that to happen. Hope should not be removed, and there is still a glimmer of hope. And I think that if we look at, you know, around the world, if you attempt to bury the past, we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. You only have to look at former Yugoslavia to see what happened there. And I think that that's a very sad reality in relation to what families carry. And I suppose the other thing, and to say, is that, you know, and I think Paddy said it in relation to, you know, the injustice of the past, continuing families carrying that. It's a very deep and indelible burden for families to carry, and I'm conscious, you know, of Tony's journey. But you think about carrying it for that length of time, and families, you know, wanting to have something right done in their lifetime. And sadly, what I would see now is many families, it's been handed to the next generation, and you see the next generation are now the campaigners. I mean, I've worked with the families that disappeared from the mid-90s, and it used to be the mothers and fathers I dealt with. Now I'm dealing with the siblings, and in fact quite a number of the siblings, I see their kids now coming to more, you know, the annual mass, the various events that we run, because they're getting them ready to take that on. And I mean, I think that's a very, you know, a very sad reality for families, and something that really we really need as a society to push hard. I think I've been heartened that politically there has been such opposition, and across the victims and survivors sector, NGOs and the various groups. But I think the ramifications if this goes through are very severe for us here.
I think London has very cleverly tried to cloak this as being they care about the families, they care about the bereaved, and they're trying to lift that burden off those left behind of feeling obliged to search for the truth despite the passing of, in some cases, decades. Is it your experience that people would be relieved if there was a blanket amnesty and everything, and the line in the sand was drawn and people were just told to move on? Do you think that in any way that would lift a burden off those left behind?
Well, I think it would lift the burden of those who've been responsible. And I don't think for families left behind, it will lift the burden. I think it will feed the injustice. And I think that families will rightly view that their loved one's death has that literally amnesty becomes amnesia. And that in some ways there's a sense that let's just close down and that it will go. And the reality is that will quite simply not happen. And I think that we will feed injustice within families, and rightly, and even within communities where they feel that the issues of the past are not addressed. And I think that is not a good place to be. So I don't believe that we're going to facilitate by closing it, by in any way closing it down, that is going to be of assistance to families. I think there needs to be a process for families who want Anne. I mean, there are families I know who've come through the historic inquiry team. They have felt that was sufficient for them, and they wouldn't want to go back. And I think it's important to say that not all families, some families feel that they have got what they needed at the time. It wasn't perfect, wasn't 100% what they wanted, but for their own family's sake, they don't want to pursue it. But there are other families who do want information, and I've seen some very good work done in relation to the Op Canova investigation for families, and some of those cases are not going to proceed in relation to forward to the Public Prosecution Service, and those families are getting answers. And I've seen that work done in a really good way, a very victim-centred way. We talk about victim-centred. If you look at the NIO's and British government's proposal, they're far from victim-centred when we consider how they've done it. I mean, they brought the written ministerial statement out in March, just as we closed service provision, direct face-to-face service provision down for victims and survivors. And then last week, then they released information over a holiday period. So, you know, again, and that was after leaking it to various media outlets, whereby it was speculation and rumor. And in fact, the night before, it was journalists were telling us what was likely to come. So, you know, I think that we have not treated victims and survivors here fairly, respectfully, or with any dignity, and that has to change. And I think there are examples of good practice that are there. But we really need a very comprehensive process that families can choose to engage with or not engage with if they so wish.
Right, well, Tony, if I could come to you now, you're up in Derry. People always say Derry is different. I think to some extent they're right. What has been the reaction in Derry in different communities and at different levels to the amnesty proposal, which may mean, we don't know yet, it'll be challenged legally, of course, but which may mean that the notorious Soldier F walks away?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's important for me to say, just in the initial response to the question, Dan, that my own father was a victim of Soldier F as well, even though he hadn't been charged with my father's killing. I suppose that there's probably different views on Soldier F depending on your perspective or whatever community you come from. But I think picking up on what Padraig said earlier on, I was interested in the phrase the independent judiciary. I think that's actually the first time I've heard that being used in sort of glowing terms of the judiciary here. And I suppose for me that is an indication of the shifting sands that have come about, largely as a result of the outbreak of peace and the way peace has been sort of sustained over the last number of decades. The British, I think, have used the judicial criminal justice system to their own advantage during the course of the conflict. And now that we have peace and an independent judiciary, and things appear to be working to the advantage of ordinary people, and not least of all the victims of violence, including state violence, that the state has now suddenly come to the conclusion that it's time to change all of that. And this is for the first time in the since the onset of the conflict, you've had the real prospect of soldiers and our agents of the state going before the courts. And indeed, Soldier F has been probably further down that road than any our soldier or our UC man. And now it's come to the point whereby all that is up for grabs. And I think let there be no doubt about this. I think that the legislation clearly isn't about equalising everyone's suffering or sense of injustice. What's going on here is that the state has made a dramatic and draconian move to stop soldiers going before the courts. See, the rest of us, the rest of us are subsidiary, collateral damage. Put it the way you want. This is about preventing soldiers going to court. And now that we have a realistic, or at least we did have a realistic prospect of certain cases being properly investigated from a criminal justice point of view, all of a sudden they're expressing concern for for families going through judicial processes. I mean, the worst thing I think in my experience that you find is the lack of acknowledgement. You see, when you know something has happened and there has been no investigation and therefore there's no real acknowledgement. That's for me, that was one of the worst things I experienced growing up, and that can't be sustained. I mean, everybody, no matter who has been killed and regardless of whose hand, deserves to be acknowledged in terms of the hurt and the loss, and that also needs to be respected by the law as well. But I think this move, I think, is scorched earth. I mean, we won't even see families getting the experience that the Ballymurphy families got with the inquest, or ourselves with the Bloody Sunday inquiry. It basically writes off a whole history, which will forever remain contested, and it probably will remain contested anyway. But at the very least, people will have, or should have had, recourse to the normal processes of civil and criminal justice. And I think once you remove that, I think you're playing around with the people's willingness to affiliate to the state, and no matter how reluctantly that has happened over the last 100 years. I think when you remove the basics of the fundamentals of the criminal justice system, which I think has been proposed here, I think you're actually removing any sense that people like myself and ours will receive justice or deserve to receive justice from the state.
Is there a sense in Derry that this was always going to happen? And is there a sense of people shrugging and said, sure, we knew that Soldier F would never be convicted, or is there a sense of fighting back, or is there both? I mean, do some people say, well, sure, we never thought the Brits would let Soldier F appear in court and be judged, or is it a sense of this must not be allowed to stand? Is there a real resentment and resilience that it cannot be allowed to happen?
I think there's an element of the former, but I think the latter probably represents the more of the opinion and activity. When we held the rally in the city centre on the Saturday, the announcement was the PPS announcement was made around Soldier F on the Friday, casting grave doubt on the chances of a successful prosecution. There was a huge turnout the next day in the city centre, so it's still a very, very raw emotion. I think when I think it's also fair to say that a lot of people would have predicted over the years that Soldier F and the likes will never see the inside of a courtroom. But to some extent, at least, that has been proven wrong. I think there is still a willingness and a resilience to continue on. And if it's about using the European Convention or using political influence further within the EU or the US. I mean, we've seen how the US influence, for instance, has tempered matters with regard to the wholesale forcing the Brexit down a certain road. I think we should be looking at the US as well to use its political influence, which is huge, over the UK government to take in our direction. I think this is I think it'll cause colossal damage to the well-being of people who have lost loved ones across the board, regardless of whose hand, and it should be stopped. I think it's immoral. I hope it proves illegal from an Article 2 point of view, but as Gemma says, whether that's enforceable or not is another matter.
I'd like to throw this one open then. I mean, how engaged do people think that the US government and the relatively new President Joe Biden will be in this? I mean, has anyone had any feedback yet from America about whether or not the great and the good over in the States are going to take up the cudgels? And it seems terrible that we should have to even consider that we have to rely in any way on American opinion and American politics to help us here at this stage. But it does seem that a lot of people are saying it will depend on how firm the Americans are prepared to be to stand up to what the British appear to be proposing. Have any of you heard from America yet whether or not the community there and the politicians there are willing to take up the cudgels? Paddy, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I mean, the Ballymurphy families in the South have had some contact with the American political representatives, mainly through the Ancient Order of Hibernians, who organised a constructive meeting with us. And the sense was, that they wanted to support them in their next steps. This is before the British government proposals, and that they were, and we've seen also Joe Biden's administration has been very protective of the Good Friday Agreement. So I think the initial signs are probably positive, but we've yet to see that formal response to the proposals. It may be that they're waiting on any further detail. But I think you'd be optimistic that certainly there'd be some response. That response, if the current proposals stay the way they are, may not be positive to the British government, and I hope it's consistent with their views so far in breaches of the Good Friday Agreement. So whilst there's no clear public position, our own private meetings with them is they're very much in support of the Stormont House Agreement and those structures for dealing with the past, and I hope they stand strong in that at this particular time, because I think they're going to be, I think you're quite right, they're a key part of this picture going forward. I think the British government will only move. I think the Irish government have very limited influence. I think the only possibility of moving is that if everybody's together on this, and there's that international, particularly the United States administration, weighing in on it as well.
Sandra, your organisation has good links with Americans. What has been the feedback that you've been getting from across the Atlantic?
Well, I suppose our urge is that they will continue to be very strong. I mean, in relation to, we feel it does undermine the Good Friday Agreement, and it's a destabiliser to peace long term if it's not adequately addressed. And we have continued to make that case to the Americans. I mean, we've always, I suppose, seen the support of America as being very important to some very difficult issues. And if I look back even to the early days of the work on the disappeared, which was a very difficult issue, not addressed here, not acknowledged here, it took American intervention to get that to move. So I would hope that they will come in very strong behind it. And I do think the fact that right across the board that people are saying this is unacceptable, that surely that has to carry something rather than this being imposed against the will all those people, and I would really hope that that common sense can prevail. I appreciate, I'm surrounded here with two lawyers, and that the legal aspect may well be where this will go, but at a very, I suppose, simplistic level, as Tony said, it's morally wrong. It's morally wrong no matter what way you look at this. It's morally wrong that people should feel that their loved ones' lives did not matter, and that they will not, what happened to them is not adequately addressed. And I would hope that sense of morality will prevail.
Yeah, and in the 1970s, and we were talking about precedents earlier on, the Spanish government introduced the Bill of Forgetting. And I'm no legal expert, but it was to entice the military into the possibility of a sustained democratic government in Spain. And it strikes me that, as I said earlier, that at the point where people like myself and the Ballymurphy families and others have had a realistic prospect of seeing the inside of a court and getting a result, I think it's not coincidental that the British have decided that they need to take a draconian approach to introducing new legislation to stop all that. And my reckoning is that the British military told them that we were in Ireland fighting a just war. We're fighting your war in Ireland, and now you're going to drag our soldiers before the courts. I don't think so, and I think that's where I think that this is where it's coming from. It's not about me. It's not about anybody around the screen. It's not about any of the concern of the Ballymurphy families and the trauma of going through the court service and so on and so forth. I think it's basically about preventing soldiers and the representatives of the military going through the judicial process. Now we have a realistic prospect of seeing that.
I think just to follow on what Tony's saying, really, obviously America's had a long-standing interest in following, the peace process and the vested interest in the Good Friday Agreement. There's been congressional hearings over the years on legacy matters, whether it's Rosemary Nelson or Pat Finucane. And I'm quite sure the US do not want to be aligned with a state that effectively is proposing an amnesty that is worse than that of the Pinochet regime. In effect, this is something more draconian and more extreme than what was proposed under the Chilean amnesty laws. So from a political point of view, I very much agree with what's been said before, that there will be a great support and allegiance is there, and all pressure must be brought to bear politically as well as legally on the British in respect of this.
Is it the impression of you all, if you want to jump in here, that the political parties are genuine in their opposition to this, or is it business as usual as far as they're concerned, and this will pass through and they'll live with it, despite everything that they're saying? Or do you genuinely think that the political parties are not prepared to put up with this? Anyone?
Maybe say something on it. I do think, and I think it's for different reasons. I mean, I think unionist politicians may have different reasons from nationalist politicians for it, but I think there is certainly at the minute a widespread approach to it, and very much opposed to it, whether that line holds or not. But at the minute, it's certainly there, and I think that's something that NGOs and families, need to keep an eye on and need to be lobbying. We shouldn't take it for granted that support will always be there. But I think at the minute it is, and this is going to be a short enough process, as I understand it, in terms of moving from proposal to draft or more detailed legislation. So we just need to be vigilant, keep an eye to that. And I think, in terms of politics, as a vote loser for all of them, that they break rank here. I mean, I think the UP politicians will find it hard on the doorsteps in Legan Valley in relation to the statute of limitations. Similarly, nationalist parties will find it difficult if they're not in line with some campaign groups that are still trying to go through the inquest process or other legal processes. So I think that'll hold, at least for the foreseeable future. And if this is a quick process, I think we all have a role in terms of keeping in touch, lobbying, making sure that this stays in the public domain, and ensuring that, you know, not only internationally but domestically we're all on the same board. What was interesting was the Lucid poll, I think was in yesterday's media, that the majority of people are against this on the ground. I think it was 88% a nationalist and something like 58, close to 60% unionist, which I was encouraged about, to be honest. So the average was in the late 60s or 70s, which I think won't go unnoticed by the British government and political parties as well. So I think that was a very useful. I know that polls aren't always accurate, but certainly political people look at polls, they watch polls as a gauge, and I think that was important.
Wise words, Paddy. We do have to pull together. Unless anybody else wants to come in, I think I'll just end by summing up what we've said, which is that the proposals are unacceptable, that they must be fought both in the courts and in the court of public opinion, and in any political forum that we have available to us. It's a battle that's only just beginning. As somebody once said, that the first item on any Irish agenda is the split. Well, let's hope not. Let's hope that we can all pull together, because we all know, I think, in our various ways, how deeply hurt individual families are. And I think we all also believe that society in general will be also deeply hurt and destabilized if these proposals go through. So let's get the message out there loud and clear. And thank you everybody for taking part in this discussion. And thank you Féile and Phobail and the PFC for organising it. Good afternoon.